Sometimes the most gripping stories are the ones that make you want to look away. This is one of those stories, a tale of human ambition, desperation, and the unforgiving nature of the earth itself. Floyd Collins wasn't supposed to die famous. He was supposed to get rich. It was January 30th, 1925, and Floyd had a plan that seemed foolproof, at least to him. Cave exploration was booming in Kentucky, and tourists were flocking to places like Mammoth Cave to gawk at underground wonders. Floyd owned a small cave on his family's property, but it wasn't bringing in the crowds or the money he desperately needed. Sand Cave, however, might be different. If he could find a connection between Sand Cave and the famous Mammoth Cave system, he'd have tourists lined up for miles. What Floyd didn't know was that this particular cave would become his tomb. Imagine you're crawling through a space so narrow that your shoulders scrape against limestone walls with every breath. The air is thick and humid, carrying the distinct smell of wet earth and something else, something ancient and untouched. Your only light source is a flickering kerosene lantern that throws dancing shadows on the walls, making the cave seem alive around you. That's exactly what Floyd Collins experienced as he squeezed deeper in a sand cave that winter morning. He'd been in parts of this cave before, but today he was pushing further than ever, armed with nothing but his lantern and an unshakable belief that fortune lay somewhere in the darkness ahead. He crawled forward on his belly. The passage got tighter and tighter. At one point, Floyd found himself in a section where the ceiling was only 9 inches high. 9 inches? That's barely enough room to lift your head, let alone turn around. Most people would have backed out right there. Floyd kept going. He was lying flat on his stomach, arms stretched out in front of him like some underground swimmer, pulling himself forward inch by agonizing inch. Every breath was a conscious effort. Every movement had to be calculated because there simply wasn't room for error. Think about the last time you felt truly claustrophobic, maybe in a crowded elevator or a small closet. Now imagine that feeling, but you're 55 feet underground, alone with tons of rock above your head, and the only way out is the way you came in. Floyd had been moving forward for what felt like hours when he decided it was time to turn back. This is where the story takes its horrific turn, because what happened next changed everything. As Floyd began the careful process of backing out through the narrow passage, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. The grinding sound of shifting rock. Above him, a limestone boulder, weighing 26.5 pounds of solid stone, had worked itself loose. Before he could react, before he could even process what was happening, the boulder crashed down onto his left leg. The pain was immediate and crushing. Floyd twisted, yanked, and kicked with everything he had, but it was useless. The boulder had pinned his leg at just the right angle to create a perfect trap. The surrounding cave walls made it impossible for him to reposition his body or get any leverage. He was stuck. Imagine being pinned under a heavy piece of furniture in your living room, except you're alone, in complete darkness, 55 feet underground, and no one knows where you are. Floyd reached forward, trying to push himself backward, but his arms had nothing to push against. He was trapped as effectively as if he'd been locked in a prison cell. Except this prison was made of solid rock, and the key was a boulder he couldn't budge. His lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to mock his predicament. His breathing quickened, and his pulse hammered in his ears. The weight of the earth pressed down on him from all sides, suffocating and unrelenting. He screamed for help. The cave walls swallowed his voice completely. For nearly 24 hours, Floyd Collins lay trapped in that narrow, cold passage. 24 hours of darkness, of pain, of growing desperation. His fingers scraped against rock until they were raw and bleeding, searching for anything, any tiny handhold or crevice that might help him escape. He screamed until his voice was hoarse, but the cave remained silent. The limestone walls that had seemed so interesting on the way in now felt like the sides of a coffin. I can't imagine what goes through someone's mind during those hours. The initial panic, then the desperate problem-solving, then the slow, creeping realization that you might actually die in this place. But Floyd wasn't entirely alone. Above ground, people were starting to worry. His friend Johnny Gerald was the first to arrive at Sand Cave, but when he tried to squeeze through the narrow entrance passage, he simply couldn't fit. The cave that had trapped Floyd was now keeping rescuers out too. The first person to actually reach Floyd was his younger brother Homer. Think about that for a moment. Homer Collins, probably scared out of his mind, wriggling through that same treacherous tunnel that had claimed his brother, bringing food and water to keep Floyd alive. Family loyalty takes on a whole different meaning when it involves crawling through a potential death trap to save someone you love. By February 2nd, 1925, a full rescue operation was underway. The plan seemed simple enough. Attach a rope and harness to Floyd and pull him out. What did go wrong? Everything as it turned out. The rescuers had underestimated the tight confines of the cave. When they pulled on the rope, instead of sliding Floyd smoothly out of the passage, they slammed his body into the rock ceiling above him. The impact was devastating. Floyd's already dire situation became even worse. Sometimes the thing that's supposed to save you ends up hurting you more. The rescuers meant well, but they just learned that good intentions don't always translate to good results. With the rope plan a failure, the rescuers faced a stark reality. If they couldn't pull Floyd out, they'd have to dig him out. Stone by stone, rock by rock. Above ground, the scene was becoming something out of a disaster movie. Campfires were lit to keep the rescuers warm as they worked in shifts. The local community rallied around the effort, bringing food, supplies, and encouragement. But those well-meaning campfires were about to seal Floyd's fate in the most cruel way possible. The heat from the fires above ground began to melt ice inside the cave. Soon, freezing water started trickling down the narrow passage where Floyd lay trapped. His already claustrophobic prison was becoming a frigid, muddy tomb. Nature has a way of being absolutely merciless. Just when you think things can't get worse, they do. On February 4th, disaster struck again. The melting ice had weakened the cave structure, and part of the passage collapsed. Not the part where Floyd was trapped. That would have been a mercy. Instead, it was the only route to reach him that caved in. Floyd was still alive, but now he was completely unreachable. Faced with this new reality, the rescuers devised what can only be described as a desperate plan. They would dig a vertical shaft straight down 55 feet to reach Floyd from above. It sounds simple, but nothing about this operation was simple. First, they couldn't use any mechanical tools. The cave's natural airflow would draw toxic fumes from gas-powered equipment directly down to Floyd, suffocating him before they could reach him. Everything had to be done by hand with pickaxes and shovels. Picture this: grown men taking turns descending into a narrow shaft, swinging pickaxes in cramped conditions, all while knowing that somewhere below them, Floyd Collins was slowly dying. At first, the team made remarkable progress, digging at a rate of 2 feet per hour. But at 10 feet down, the shaft narrowed. At 15 feet, they hit solid rock and had to switch to pickaxes. Soon they encountered massive boulders that slowed their progress to a crawl. Still, they dug on. Time was running out, and everyone knew it. By February 11th, Floyd had been trapped for 11 days. 11 days of cold, darkness, and slowly failing hope. The rescuers were close, tantalizingly close. The shaft was nearly complete, and they were carving out a lateral tunnel to reach Floyd's chamber. But something was wrong. The light bulb they'd been using to check if Floyd was still breathing had gone out. Fearing the worst, they worked even faster, driven by the dread of breaking through too late. Imagine the psychological weight on those rescuers. They'd been working around the clock for nearly 2 weeks, and now they were racing against a clock that might have already run out. The work was backbreaking. Men descended into the shaft in shifts, chipping away at limestone and hauling buckets of rock and dirt to the surface. The community above had turned the rescue site into a temporary town, with hundreds of people maintaining vigil. Floyd Collins, a cave explorer who'd entered Sand Cave seeking fortune, had become a national sensation, not for triumph, but for his slow, agonizing demise. Finally, on February 16th, they reached his chamber. Floyd Collins lay motionless, still pinned beneath the rock that had trapped him over 2 weeks earlier. He had died days earlier, likely between February 13th and 14th, after spending 18 days trapped in the cold, crushing darkness. The cruel irony is that Floyd probably knew help was coming. He could likely hear the sounds of digging, the voices of rescuers getting closer and closer. But he also knew, in those final days, that they wouldn't make it in time. Floyd's story should have ended there, but it didn't. A funeral was held above the cave, with hundreds gathering to mourn a man who had captured the nation's attention. But to his devoted brother Homer, Sand Cave was no proper grave. 2 months later, Homer and a group of friends returned. On April 23, 1925, they dug a new tunnel from the opposite side of the cave, finally reaching Floyd's remains. His body was carefully removed and brought to Cave City for embalming. There's something both touching and heartbreaking about Homer's determination to retrieve his brother's body. Floyd had entered that cave seeking fortune, but what he found was a slow, suffocating death, and even in death, he couldn't find peace. Floyd Collins' story became one of the most famous cave rescue attempts in American history, but it was also one of the most tragic. His death highlighted the dangers of solo cave exploration and the limitations of 1920s rescue technology. What haunts me most about this story isn't just the tragedy of Floyd's death. It's the image of those rescuers, working day and night for over 2 weeks, knowing that somewhere below them, a man was slowly dying. They never gave up, even when hope seemed impossible. The Sand Cave incident also marked one of the first major news stories to be covered extensively by radio and newspapers across the country. Floyd Collins became famous in death in a way he never was in life, his story serving as a grim reminder of the price of ambition and the unforgiving nature of the earth itself. Sometimes I wonder what Floyd was thinking in those final days. Was he angry? Scared? Resigned? Did he regret going into that cave? Or was he still hoping, even at the end, that fortune might somehow come from his suffering? We'll never know. What we do know is that Floyd Collins entered Sand Cave on January 30th, 1925, seeking to change his life. Instead, he found death in the darkness, trapped forever in the very earth he'd spent his life exploring. His story reminds us that sometimes the greatest adventures exact the highest price, and that the line between discovery and disaster can be as thin as a sheet of limestone, as narrow as a 9-inch passage, and as unforgiving as a 26.5-pound boulder that falls at just the wrong moment. As horrifying as Floyd's fate was, at least he never drowned. Small comfort, perhaps, but in a story this dark, we take what consolation we can find.